Good morning, Professor McQuiston. Can you hear me?
Good morning, Sir Brian. I can hear you fine.
Good, and you can see me?
I can.
Well, that's a good start. In a moment or two, I'm going to ask Mary to invite you to affirm. Let me first, though, explain who you're talking to. There's a small audience here in Aldwych House in London. But I imagine that the bulk of your audience today are going to be online, watching either on YouTube or on live stream. I can't tell you precisely how many there will be, but may well be approaching 3 figures.
Okay.
In a moment or two, Miss Scott is going to ask you the questions, but first, Mary, please. I should ask you, you're in the offices of your lawyer, are you?
Yes, I am indeed.
Very well.
Okay.
Please state your full name.
Robert Whitford McQuiston.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Miss Scott.
Can you see and hear me?
I can, Miss Scott, yes.
Can I first of all start by asking you this? You given your name in your witness statement as Dr. Robert McQuiston, but I see also that you have a professorship, but you call yourself Dr. McQuiston, do you?
That was a time-limited professorship, so that expired in 2011.
And your title doctor is not because you're a clinical doctor, but because you've got a PhD.
That's correct.
I'm going to now just go through your and go through your career, give an overview of your career, starting in 1970, where you had a number of roles: principal officer, then deputy principal, then assistant principal, in a range of divisions of the Department of Agriculture for Northern Ireland. Is that right?
That's correct.
So that was between 1970 and 1984?
Yes.
And then in 1984, you took up a role as the Assistant Secretary to the Health Services Division of the Department of Health and Social Services in Northern Ireland.
Yes, that's right.
And you held that post until 1988?
Yes.
And I'm going to come back and ask you some questions about your time in the Health Services Division. You then moved from there to become the Assistant Secretary of the Management and Personnel Division of the DHSS Northern Ireland between 1988 and 1990.
That's right.
And you then went on secondment to become the Director of the Northern Ireland Centre for Healthcare Cooperation and Development in 1990.
That's correct, yep.
And that was a post you held until 1999.
Yes.
And you say that that's called NI Care or NICare? How do we pronounce that?
NICare, yes.
NICare. And what did NICare do?
Basically helping other health services around the world to improve their services, reform their services, mainly in Russia and Central and Eastern Europe and in the Far East. So there'll be countries where perhaps there wasn't a satisfactory primary care service, maybe no such thing as general practitioners, very centralized services. So we were helping them to modernize and reform their services.
So you didn't have any role in decision-making in Northern Ireland over that period?
Not at all during that period, no.
And were you keeping up with what was going on in Northern Ireland during that period?
From a general interest point of view, yes, I was.
And then in 1999, again, still on secondment from the Department of Health and Social Security, you took up a role as the International Programme Director of NICare, a role you held until 2004.
Yeah. The reason for that was that I was spending more and more time overseas, and it was becoming difficult to direct the organisation in Belfast and be overseas at the same time. So we appointed a new director, and I became international project director.
And then you became a health and social services advisor to NICARE between 2004 and 2006.
Yes, that was after my retirement from the department in 2004.
And in that role, what were you doing?
Essentially the same work, but just with a different heading.
So again, looking at the international picture rather than the domestic picture.
Yes.
And then between 2006 and 2011, you were a visiting professor and health policy and management specialist at the Healthcare Research and Development Group at the University of Ulster. Is that right?
That's right.
And were you teaching? Were you lecturing? What were you doing in that role?
No, what happened was that NICARE ceased to exist in 2006, and a number of us wanted to continue the work we were doing. So we managed to organise this unit at the university, and essentially, no, there was no teaching involved. It was purely research and the same kind of overseas work that I had been doing before. So
before getting on to your role between 1984 and 1988 in the Health Services Division, I'm just going to ask you some questions to get an idea about the structure of the department at the time that you were there in the 1980s. So is it right to understand from your statement that the department was divided into a policy directorate and a management directorate, which was known as, and you refer to in your statement, as the management executive?
That's correct.
And what was, broadly speaking, what was the difference between the two, those two parts of the department?
Well, basically, the policy side, as the name suggests, was responsible for policy and legislation. Once policies were decided, and it was a case of implementing policies, that was down to the executive. They were the sort of management role. They managed the 4 health boards, and they looked after the personnel issues in the health boards and so forth. So they're more at the hands-on operational side of the department, whereas the policy side, I suppose, was doing the thinking about how to do things.
We've heard from witnesses from the Department of Health in London that the Department of Health had what they called a sponsorship role for agencies like the blood services and so on. Would that role have sat with the management executive?
Yes, it would.
And how well, in your experience, did dividing the department up in that way work?
Well, it already had been divided by the time I arrived, so I didn't have the previous arrangement to compare it with. But it seemed to work well, and it seemed to make sense. And actually, I would have found it quite difficult to imagine it working as a single corporate unit, because I think it was the way to do it.
And to what extent were you able to, or did you have any role in ensuring that the policies that you'd formulated were being implemented in the way that you had foreseen they would be or should be?
Well, I can't think of anything specific, but there was quite a lot of interchange between the two sides, and I can imagine if something was happening in a way that hadn't been envisaged, there would be exchanges back and forwards, and there probably would be adjustments made accordingly. At the end of the day, the permanent secretary was responsible for both sides of the department, and if there was an issue like that couldn't be resolved, he would have been called upon.
So in terms of the management of the department, then the permanent secretary sat at the top over both sides of the department.
That's right.
And then below the permanent secretary was who?
There were undersecretaries. As far as I recall, there was one undersecretary for each side. George Buchanan was the undersecretary on the policy side. And I think it was Ronnie Sterling was the undersecretary on the other side.
And then below the undersecretaries sat the assistant secretaries of the divisions.
Yes. And on the policy side, there were 4 divisions. My own, which looked after community health services, family practitioner services, personal social services, and general hospital services. Then there was another division headed by Jack Scott looking after acute hospital services. And then, bearing in mind that health and social services are integrated in Northern Ireland, we also had 2 divisions dealing with social services. One social care for the elderly, and the other social care for children.
And in terms of meetings with the undersecretaries and the permanent secretaries, was there a regular programme of meetings, or did you meet with them as and when you needed to?
As and when required. I think on the management side, there were more regular sort of structured meetings, but on the policy side, it was more ad hoc.
And does the same go for meetings with the heads, with the other assistant secretaries sitting in the other divisions?
Yes, indeed. I mean, there could be cross-cutting issues that would require, obviously discussion and interchange, and there may be issues that involve more than one division, where perhaps the undersecretary would be involved along with the relevant assistant secretaries.
You've set out in your witness statement a little bit more detail about the areas of responsibility that your division had, and I'm not going to go to those now, but you tell us that you also had a role in relation to health promotion and disease prevention measures, including public education about the risks associated with infectious diseases such as AIDS. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in that role, you attended and sat on and chaired, in fact, some committees and working groups.
That's right.
And I'll come back to ask you some questions about that a little bit later on this morning.
Okay.
Do you know, or can you recall now, whether the management of long-term conditions like bleeding disorders came under the acute division headed by Jack Scott or under the health service division?
Issues relating to blood and blood products would have been on Jack Scott's side. He would have been responsible for accident and emergency, surgery, orthopedics, things like that. The branch that I had on general hospital services would have been concerned more with general medicine, oncology, those kind of issues, cardiology and so forth. So really, issues related to bleeding disorders and bleeding diseases would have fallen on the other side.
How big was the staff team in your division?
I had four principal officers, and I suppose within each of those branches there might have been an average of about 10 staff, something like that.
And was that a similar size to Jack Scott's division, can you recall?
I would have thought probably broadly similar. He may not have had as many branches. I'm not sure.
And what was the workload like?
It was fairly substantial because it's covering, almost all of the health service when you think about it. So yes, I mean, there were a lot of issues most of the time, and fair degree of pressure, yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about how the Chief Medical Officer and his team fitted into the structure. So we've heard evidence that in England there were, at points anyway, dual structures in the civil service. So there was an administrative and a medical side. Was that similar in Northern Ireland? Was the Chief Medical Officer the head of his own team that sat outside what you've described to us as the policy division and the management division?
I would say sat alongside rather than outside, yeah.
And what kind of contact did you have or could you have with either the Chief Medical Officer or any of his clinicians?
Quite regular contact. Most of the time it would be with his staff, but from time to time it would be the Chief Medical Officer himself, and he was always quite accessible. There wasn't an issue there at all.
And did you have a particular member of his staff allocated to your division or a particular point of contact, or could you just really ask advice from anyone that you wanted to?
It depended on the issue. They had things divided between them as to who was responsible for what. I seem to recall that in my case, most of the contact was with Dr. Nick Donaldson, but we would have had contact with some of the other medical staff as well.
And was there a programme or a schedule of regular meetings between you and relevant staff from the CMO team, or was it, again, an as and when ad hoc arrangement?
Ad hoc, as and when, yeah.
And now I'm going to ask you some questions about contact with ministers. It's right to understand, is it, that during your time in the Health Services Division, it was a period of direct rule in Northern Ireland by the government in Westminster?
Was.
And so that means, is this right, that the UK government had taken over direct responsibility for government decisions in Northern Ireland, with ministers in the Northern Ireland office directing the Northern Ireland Civil Service?
That's right.
And during your time in the health service, Douglas Hurd was the Secretary of State, followed by Tom King in September 1985. Is that right?
I think that's right, yeah.
And then Richard Needham was the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Northern Ireland from 1985 to 1992.
He was.
And
prior to that, Stappen, I think it was. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed that, what you just said.
Prior to that, it was Chris Stappen. Yeah.
Did you have a particular point of contact in the Northern Ireland office?
Not at all. No, I didn't.
Did you have much contact with the Northern Ireland office?
Not really with officials, no. Perhaps on occasions, if you're over in London, maybe the minister was answering something in the House. You might have had contact with some of the officials at that time, but normal day-to-day, running a thing, no, not at all. The minister really was the only contact with the NIO.
Sorry, I missed that. What was the only contact with the NIO?
The minister was the only contact.
And when you say the minister, do you mean Richard Needham?
I do, yeah.
So in your witness statement, you say that Westminster had an overall coordinating role on issues impacting on the whole of the UK, and that in reality the main policy initiatives would come from the Department of Health in London out to Northern Ireland. Is that the right way to understand it?
That's right, although there would be obviously issues from time to time that were specifically local, but as an overarching statement, that would be correct, yeah.
And the way that those policies came out of the Department of Health would be directly, would it, to you in the department in Northern Ireland rather than via the Northern Ireland office?
Yes, directly, not via the Northern Ireland office.
And then you also tell us that once you'd received policy initiatives from London, you would then consider whether to adopt, reject or tailor that policy for Northern Ireland.
That's correct, although there would be occasions where there would be no choice in the matter, like, for example, the one I mentioned of the limited list of drugs that could be prescribed. We wouldn't have had any right to desist from that when we had to do it.
And then you tell us that once a policy was developed in Northern Ireland, the role that the minister had would be to sign off on the policy developed by the department in Northern Ireland.
That's correct, although he would have a role, obviously, in developing the policy as well. at various stages of the process, he would normally be involved.
So can you, is this right that the Minister was involved in development of policy in health in Northern Ireland over the period that you were there?
He was.
But you tell us in your statement that you don't recall the Northern Ireland office having any role in health policy development. Do you mean by that officials in the Northern Ireland office?
Yes.
You also tell us that you were able to discuss issues of policy directly with the Minister, with Richard Needham. Can you tell us a little bit about how you would go about that, whether or not the decision to approach him was the decision that you would make yourself, and how easily accessible he was to you?
He was fairly accessible. What would happen normally would be the issue would be developed, possibly in discussion with the Under-Secretary and or the Permanent Secretary. A point come in the process where the Minister needed to be involved. It would be a case of then writing a note to him through the private office, setting out the issue and asking for his approval or for a meeting perhaps. He would respond accordingly, either in writing, saying that's fine, go ahead, or need to discuss this. Then we would have a meeting, and it depended on the issue, what sort of mix of written and verbal input there was.
In what circumstances would you escalate a matter to the Minister?
If it was a new policy, if it was something that perhaps was likely to maybe lead to adverse reactions from sections of the public, or indeed the reverse, if it was likely to be a good news story, the Minister might want to be associated with that. If it was a routine matter, not a new area of policy, and one which was unlikely to create any controversy, it wouldn't be referred to.
Would it be right to understand from that many of the decisions relating to HIV and AIDS would have been escalated to the Minister on the basis that they were or could be controversial?
Yes, I think that's fair comment.
And how about policies with a budgetary implication? Would they be escalated to the Minister?
Not necessarily. I think it would depend if there was perhaps an issue of prioritising expenditure in one area as opposed to another. He may have been consulted about that kind of issue.
Now, you've told us that your division in the department, had no role in blood and blood products. So is it right to understand that you had no particular relationship with the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service?
That is correct.
And equally, you had no particular relationship with any haemophilia centres?
Correct.
And so is it right to understand from that you can't give the inquiry any evidence about issues such as decisions made about self-sufficiency of blood products in Northern Ireland?
I'm afraid I can't.
And nor whether there were any governmental policies concerned with prescribing practices for those with bleeding disorders? No. Equally, is this right? Did your division have any role in... Is it right to understand your division did not have a role in the payment schemes for those infected and affected in Northern Ireland?
No.
And your department had no role in licensing and regulation of pharmaceutical companies?
No. We had a role, as I recall, in establishing pharmacies, and there was a policy that new pharmacies couldn't be set up close to existing ones. There had to be a sort of a reasonable network. We had a role in that, and just to ensure that pharmacy services were available as widely as possible and not concentrated in one location.
Now you've told us a little bit about the limited list in your witness statement. Can you recall whether blood products were on the limited list?
I am pretty sure they weren't.
Are you able to help us with how budgets for those treatments were set up, were set up or dealt with by the department?
Well, just for blood products?
Yes.
No, I'm afraid I couldn't.
Can I then just take you to SCGV 40105_021? So this is a letter addressed to you, dated the 4th of October 1988, and we don't need to turn through, but it's from Dr. McNiven from the Scottish Home and Health Department. And it starts by saying, I'm writing, I hope, to the right person about the future arrangements for the processing in Scotland of Northern Ireland plasma. And then it goes on to explain that Scotland has lost its self-sufficiency, and asks questions of you as a representative of Northern Ireland Department as to whether or not you would, we can see at paragraph 4A, withdraw your agreement to fractionate your plasma, and then if we go over the page, B, invest in the PFC. So we can see at paragraph 5, 2 questions. Do you still want your plasma processed by the SNBTS? And B, would you be prepared to contribute to the capital cost of the upgrading at the protein fractionation centre? Now, is it right to understand that while this correspondence was addressed to you, in fact, he hadn't got the right person, and that this was passed on to Jack Scott?
That is correct, yeah.
Sorry.
I had also moved on to the other side of the department, I think in April of that year, so on 2 accounts, you got the wrong person.
Yes, you weren't even in post in the department by October 1988.
That's correct.
And it wouldn't have, in any event, have been your successor.
Wouldn't have been, no, that's right.
I'm going to turn now to ask you some questions about AIDS and your role in AIDS and HIV. Now, you have told us that you had a role in health promotion and disease prevention generally for Northern Ireland in relation to infectious diseases, including AIDS. I'll come on to ask you some questions in a moment about the role you had in the public education campaigns on AIDS, but just to try and understand whether anything else fell into your remit. Would testing for HIV have fallen into your remit?
No, I don't recall any involvement in testing.
So that would have been dealt with by Jack Scott's division?
Either Jack Scott's division or the management side of the department.
How about treatment of those with HIV, so hospital services for those with HIV?
Well, again, I think that would be on Jack's side.
And if there were community services for those for HIV, would that have fallen within your remit?
It would.
And do you recall any such services or any decisions having to be made about that?
I do. I recall in the context of the Northern Ireland Committee on AIDS, various initiatives being discussed and agreed, including information packs and videos for GPs, so they were to help them with dealing with the issue at their level.
So a training and information dissemination role.
That's correct. Yeah.
Were you involved in any of the decisions taken by the blood services about the selection of those donors considered to be at risk of HIV?
No.
Turning then to your role on in the various, well, first of all, the Ministerial Steering Group on AIDS, or sometimes referred to as the Interdepartmental Committee on AIDS. And if we can just do this by reference to a document, CABO 40221, and can we go to page 2, please? So we can see that this is headed Ministerial Steering Group on AIDS, first meeting on the 2nd of December 1985. And we can see a number of attendees. For DHSS, we've got Barney Hayhoe MP, the CMO, Dr. Aitchison, attendees from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, got Lord Glenarthur and others from the Home Office, Lord Trefgarne from the Defence, Treasury attendees, Cabinet Office, DES, which I understand is Department of Education and Science, Employment, Welsh Office, an MP there, and there you are representing the Northern Ireland Office, and then Environment, Scottish Office, and DTI. So is it right to understand that you were attending this meeting in the place of Richard Needham?
That's correct, yeah.
And then if we go over to the third page, please. We can see at the first paragraph, Mr. Hayhoe welcomed representatives from other government departments. He explained that the AIDS infection represented a serious public health problem which had wide implications for many departments. A paper outlining some of these implications had already been circulated. Much had been done by the DHSS to try to limit the spread of the infection. He hoped that an interdepartmental group would be set up following the Chief Medical Officer's presentation on the disease. The aim of the interdepartmental group would be to develop a coordinated strategy towards the wider issues connected with the disease. And then we can see that there is a presentation by the Chief Medical Officer, and that is summarised. And we can just look at the headings there, definition, spread, epidemiology, and so on. And then if we turn over the page, we can see after the conclusion of the presentation that there is a discussion, and we see at that first paragraph there, Mr. Hayhoe said that an announcement would be made that day about the allocation of a further £6.3 million devoted to AIDS measures, including a major public health campaign. And then there is a discussion about the form of that campaign. And then if we go over the page, we can see at the end conclusion, the terms of reference of the official group were agreed. Mr. Hayhoe said he hoped that this group would meet early in the new year and prepare a paper for the next meeting of the ministerial group. Is it right to understand that Mr. Hayhoe's hope was realised, that this, following the presentation from the Chief Medical Officer, a group was, an interdepartmental group was set up and there were subsequent meetings?
Yes, that's correct.
And then we can see here as well at the end there seems to be another group being set up to advise the ministerial group. So we see that Mr. Hayhoe said he hoped that this group, the terms of reference for the official group, that this group would meet and prepare a paper for the next meeting of the ministerial group.
Yes, yes. I'd sort of overlooked the fact that there were two separate groups, I must say, but I would have been attending both the interdepartmental group and the ministerial group on most occasions. Richard Needham seemed to never be available on those occasions of those meetings.
So we can see that that first meeting is 2nd of December 1985. The second meeting is in April 1986. And we can see that at SHTM 301036. Again, this is now chaired by Barney Hayhoe, and we can again see you attending towards the bottom of the page for Northern Ireland, and then I understand that John Mackay is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Scotland, and Mark Robinson, Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Wales. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, yes.
If we can just turn over the page, we can see the discussion seems to be focusing on the information campaign. So 1.2.1, Mr. Hayhoe said that the campaign had been launched in mid-March with 2 rounds of advertising in the national newspapers. The advertising was backed up by the College of Health recorded telephone information service and a health education leaflet. And then if we go down to 1.2.2, there's more discussion about newspaper advertising, and then Mr. Hayhoe said that so far there'd been no advertising in local newspapers, and he agreed this should be considered. And then there is discussion about the language of the advert and so on. And if we go over to page 3, we see your contribution at 1.2.4. Mr. Robinson makes a comment about the pitch of the advert and reactions from his perspective, and then you say that many in Northern Ireland had not seen the advertising, and you suggested that a half-page advert was more likely to be read. So before I ask you questions in relation to that, it's probably helpful just to look at the advert that is being discussed there. So it's NHBT 307971. So this is a covering letter, just to date the attachment. It's dated 13th of March 1986, and it said that Tom Murray already sent you this to Dr. Gunson, so I'm not suggesting you would have seen this letter, but sent you a copy of the HEC leaflet and details of the advertising campaign, which is due to start on Sunday. I now attach a copy of the proof of the advertisement, which will be shown to the press this afternoon. So that's from Dr. Aitchison. And then if we go over the page, we can see the advert, the national advert, Are You at Risk from AIDS? Is this the advertisement that you were talking about, do you think, during that meeting?
I obviously don't know. I presume it is. And what it was about this advert that wasn't eye-catching, I'm not sure. It looks to me as if it would be virtually a full-page advert.
Yes, I think what you're suggesting is that it would be better to have a half-a-page advert.
Yeah, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense if this is the advert we're talking about. Why would I want to reduce it from a page to half a page? It may well be that there was some other advertising that preceded this, I'm not sure.
Can you recall what the factual basis of your contribution to that meeting was? How you had come to understand that not many in Northern Ireland had seen the national advertising campaign?
There must have been some discussion about it back in the department before I went to the meeting, and there must have been, some reaction generally in Northern Ireland that maybe people hadn't seen it, or it wasn't eye-catching enough, or I don't know. I presume this appeared on all the national papers which would be circulating in Northern Ireland. So I'm really at a loss as to what was behind that comment. It's 35 years ago, and I can't recall what specifically it was that led to it.
Now, is it right to understand that the issues about regional or local campaigns wouldn't have been dealt with within the ministerial group? That was concerned with national matters, but it would have been picked up in the Northern Ireland Committee on AIDS.
Yes.
So if we can turn then to your work on that committee, and if we can do so by looking first at RHSC 5041_108. And we can see that this is a letter from you to Dr. McKenna at the Eastern Health and Social Services Board of the 10th of November 1985, and it's headed ad hoc group on AIDS. And you say, in recognition of the many and rapidly emerging initiatives.
It does say 86, I think.
I'm sorry?
It says 86. You're.
Oh, what did I say? Did I say?
85.
I beg your pardon. It does say 86.
So this is 1986.
Thank you. In recognition of the many and rapidly emerging initiatives which are taking place in other parts of the United Kingdom in relation to AIDS, it's been decided that a small informal ad hoc group should be established in Northern Ireland. The department would see the group primarily as providing a focal point for ensuring that a coordinated approach to this disease is adopted across all 4 board areas. The group should also serve as a source of advice on specific aspects of AIDS where necessary. And then it sets out the membership of the group, which of course includes yourself, representatives from the 4 health boards, and Dr. Main we can see there as well.
Yep.
First of all, was this your idea, your initiative?
I can imagine that the issue was discussed in London, the idea of, the need for this kind of coordinating activity in other parts of the country as well. So I dare say I probably would have initiated the thinking on it, yes.
And does it follow from what you've just said that you think the prompt for it would have been what was being said in London?
Well, I think there could have been, obviously the issue would be under consideration anyway, but setting up formal groupings to look after these functions may well have come from the discussions in London.
Now, it could be said that setting up a group of this kind in November 1986 was quite late in the piece, given that HIV and, not HIV, HTLV3 and AIDS had been around and a matter of concern for some time by then. What would you say to that?
Well, I think, first of all, there would have been coordinating activity happening anyway on a more ad hoc basis prior to that. And I think I'm right in saying it was in 86 that the ministerial group was established, isn't that right? And the interdepartmental group. So activity was going on anyway, but formalising the groups seemed to take place both in London and in Northern Ireland around that time.
Yes, so the ministerial group was December 1985. That first meeting was December 1985.
Okay. And the interdepartmental group then followed shortly after that, I think.
In terms of the purpose of that group, as you've said, it's to coordinate information exchange between the 4 health boards. That was its primary remit, was it?
That's correct. That's correct.
And that included potential risk from contaminated blood products.
Yes.
Can we turn now then to RHSC 5041_107. This is a question about the membership of the group. So we've got here a letter again from you to the General Manager, Mr. J. Lamb, of Southern Health and Social Services Board of the 29th of December 1986. You are responding to a letter from him in which he appears to have suggested that the membership of the committee, formerly known as the Ad Hoc Group on AIDS, now it seems to be called the Northern Ireland Committee on AIDS, might be extended to include representatives from the dental, nursing and social work professions. You turned down that request. Why was that?
Well, I think the feeling was that having the Chief Administrative Medical Officer from each board on the committee provided a conduit for these other professions to make their input. Also, if there were specific issues, say, dealing with pharmacy or dealing with nursing, the relevant officers would be able to attend those particular meetings. To increase the membership of the main committee to include all those professions would have resulted in a very cumbersome committee, which would have been quite difficult to manage and difficult to reach decisions. So that was the main reason for not going down that road.
Now, the inquiries heard evidence that some dentists and healthcare professionals in the 1980s were refusing to treat people with AIDS. Was that were those sorts of allegations that you were aware of at the time?
I honestly don't recall that at all. If that happened, it must have been a very small number of cases. I don't recall it at all.
We'll look at one meeting minute from the Northern Ireland Committee on AIDS, formerly the Ad Hoc Group on AIDS, DHNI 0100055. So we can see here that this is the minutes of the 7th meeting of the committee, and we can see that you are chairing it with the other attendees there. If we could go over the page, please. I want to pick up on 2 points. Paragraph 4.6. AIDS and blood transfusion. Dr. McQuiston reported that the feeling at national level was that any advertising on this subject was best left to the National Blood Transfusion Service. Members accepted this view. It was noted that blood supplies in Northern Ireland were at a reasonable level, but recent surveys amongst students had shown that a significant proportion still thought that HIV virus was transmissible by donating blood. So is it right to understand from this that the question of what donors should be told about whether or not they were at high risk and should be deferring themselves from giving blood was a matter not being dealt with by your committee, but being dealt with by the Blood Transfusion Service?
That is correct. I think the feeling was that what we were trying to do in the committee was to develop material for the general public which would inform them about how they could adjust their own behaviour to protect themselves and to avoid risk. I think that the risk from potential risk from blood transfusions of a different order is not something really that individuals can protect themselves against. They need to be advised, obviously, about the position which we felt was more appropriate for the blood transfusion service, not to sort of conflate the two issues.
And then if we could turn to the next page and pick up another point, which is if we could go down to paragraph 6, public education strategy in Northern Ireland, and you were reporting on a smaller group meeting which had met following had met on the 9th of February, and following this, a press conference to mark the launch of the new HEA advertising campaign had been held in Northern Ireland. So that's the context. And then it says this, he, I think that must mean you, indicated that in order to map out and develop a regional advertising strategy for Northern Ireland, it would be helpful if boards could submit details of any initiatives they were planning over the next year which could attract regional publicity and thereby help to maintain a continuum of awareness in the province. So is it right to understand from this that the more local, regional advertising was being overseen by this committee with the boards, health boards, feeding into that strategy?
That is correct, yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about what that advertising campaign, that public information campaign, consisted of?
Well, it would have been covering many of the areas covered in the national campaign as well, but would have been tailoring the messages to suit the Northern Ireland situation, which did vary to a few small degrees. Well, one fairly big aspect of difference was in relation to drug misuse, which was at a very, very low level in Northern Ireland at the time, due largely to the security situation. And we felt that in the local strategy, we shouldn't be giving emphasis to that because it wasn't a problem. On the contrary, there was probably a bigger problem for us with people travelling away on business. And so we would have focused in on that to a larger extent, advising people on their behaviour when they're out of the country on business to avoid the behaviour that could result in infection.
Were there sensitivities in Northern Ireland about messaging regarding the risk to men who had sex with men, given the fact that until just a few years before that had been illegal?
Yes, so probably it would have been a little bit more controversial in the Northern Ireland situation because of the more conservative attitudes to those issues.
And how did that impact on the messages that you were trying to get out there?
Well, I don't think it did impact. I think the message had to be got out, and there was no point in trying to be too subtle about it because the message wouldn't have got across. So I think we appreciated that it probably would ruffle a few feathers, but I think it didn't materially affect the line that was taken in the advertising.
Now, we saw you contributing in the ministerial meeting to the fact that the national advertising campaign hadn't been, you thought, very successful in Northern Ireland. Can you recall whether you took any steps to remedy that fact within this group, or at all?
Well, obviously the issue we're discussing at the moment of the local advertising campaign would have had an impact there. I mean, if it was felt that the national advertising hadn't really hit the mark, then it was all the more important to have a local campaign that would do so. And
how effective would you say that the campaign and the information dissemination was during your time there?
I do recall that we did have evaluation of the campaign, and I'm pretty sure that as a result of that, we adjusted it as we went along, and I think the overall feeling was that it was successful. We were getting the message across, and it was affecting behaviour.
And in fact, we can see, I think, some of that if we turn over the page. The UK Public Education Strategy, and there's a reference to a paper there about the HEA's UK advertising package, which was designed to increase general awareness. And the point's made it's targeted at heterosexual populations in the younger age groups. TV and press advertisements were being used, but difficulties had been experienced with the use of advertisements in cinemas. And then it says this a little bit further down. Dr. Horner indicated that there was evidence from patients attending the STD clinic at the RVH that the middle class groups were changing their sexual behaviour, but there was no similar change apparent amongst lower socio-economic groups. And he suggested that it was important to target the latter group in particular. And then he makes a point that although the number of STD patients remain high, AIDS and HIV did not seem to be a reason for this. So is that the sort of information you're talking about, the sort of, as you go along, evaluating and working out what changes need to be made?
Exactly, yeah.
Now, do you recall whether or not you, whether your group took into account or had any information from the expert advisory group on AIDS operating out of London?
You mean the group chaired by Mr. Hayhoe?
No, it's a different group, not the ministerial group. The expert advisory group on AIDS. Does that ring any bells with you?
Is that the one that arose from the ministerial group? No.
No.
That's not the...
No, it's entirely separate.
Doesn't ring a bell with me at all. No.
Now, we've heard evidence in the inquiry that AIDS wasn't seen as a significant problem in Northern Ireland because levels of transmission were low. Would you agree with that?
The levels were low, but I don't think we were complacent. I think we were aware that it was a looming problem and that action needed to be taken.
And did you, or were you involved in any links with the Republic of Ireland during that time?
Yes, there were meetings between the ministers, north and south, on at least one or two occasions I can recall, just comparing the approach. And again, it's conceivable that we would have maybe learned things from that could have influenced our approach as well, and perhaps vice versa.
And were you aware of the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS during this time?
Oh, yes.
Were there any steps being taken by the department to try and combat that, to ensure that people were coming forward to be tested and accessing services and so on?
Yes, I think that would have been part of the campaign to try and counter that sort of attitude, definitely.
And what strategies were put in place to try and do that? How do you go about doing that? How did you go about doing that?
Well, I can't honestly remember the details of that, but I mean, it would have been simply stating the facts as they were. And for example, the fact that AIDS can be contracted by heterosexuals as well as homosexuals, and therefore, you know, the targeting of a particular group would be inappropriate.
So those are the questions that I had. I wonder whether we could take a break so that core participants can suggest further questions to me.
Yes, certainly. Well, we're just about ready for our morning break, a little bit early, possibly. But we'll take a break for half an hour now and then come back and hope that that is long enough for those who want to suggest questions to you to do so. Let me explain to you, Dr. McQuiston, that there are a number of core participants in the inquiry represented by their legal representatives, whose representatives have a right on their behalf to put forward questions to counsel, to ask you, plainly, that might reflect the evidence you have given, which they'll be thinking about as you've been giving it. So we have to give them time for that. But in any event, it's probably time for a coffee break or a comfort stop, and we'll come back no earlier than 11:30. It may be a little bit later if some late questions or a large number of questions come in. I can't tell you how many that will be, and I can't tell you quite how long that will take, because it depends upon the questions, obviously. This being a break, in your evidence, and your evidence being on oath, what you mustn't do is talk about any of the evidence which you've given to anyone, whoever that person is. I'll see you not before 11:30.